Right. Hello, everybody. My name is Kattein. I always thought of architecture as something that can't just be about buildings and spaces, and that there's something in the design process that's actually really much about people and the process of collaborative working, which I'm really pleased to just have heard about a collaborative working method and contractual suite and associated insurance suite that all bring this together formally as well. But I've always thought of architecture as something that where almost the buildings are just a byproduct and where the real potential sits in the act of doing architecture. One of the places where our approach is particularly relevant and where our practice has really gained a lot of its skills is in high street regeneration. London has over 600 high streets. 2/3 of Londoners live within 5 minutes walk of a high street. And at the same time, nationally, out-of-town retail space has increased by 30% in the last decade. And online retail continues to grow, taking a record 17.1% market share in July 2018. You will have all seen in the news the woes of the high street, and Brexit isn't going to make those easier. High street regeneration isn't necessarily something new. There have been heritage objectives in the past to invest in high streets. There have been transport objectives, in particular in the 1960s, that have transformed town centres. But that high street regeneration should have a civic objective with an aim of garnering community benefits across sectors is something really new and something that we've set a really sort of powerful precedent with on the High Road Leighton project, which we started working on in 2010. Right after the financial crash, Waltham Forest Council made the daring decision to invest rather than to close the purse strings. And the effect of that's been really transformative. So that's one of the terraces in Leighton. There's another one. And what's so powerful about these projects is clients. There's 50 of them typically on a project like this, sometimes more. There'll be uncles involved and aunts and brothers and sisters and business partners and various local stakeholders. And a lot of these people are dependent on their business for their family income. There have been stakeholders who've been on the ground sometimes for generations and whose life depends on running their business. Now, what you can do when working with these people and treating them as clients is really a powerful move, because you can come up together with a vision to transform your environment. And this is just as much about shifting people's perception. The success of the high street isn't just actually about filling empty shops and bringing more retail in there. It's about people, a community, realizing that they have a responsibility to respond to the offer on their high street, that otherwise it's going to go away. And that's really been a focus in Leighton, that from what you can see up there, a down and out peripheral town centre in East London. We've created a place that the Evening Standard referred to as the Notting Hill of the East. And this not as something that we just came up with. We literally started this project with no specific vision, with no anticipation, and we started talking to these stakeholders and the people on the ground and the local community to work out what it is that we can embark on together to transform the way this town centre is perceived and operates. And this isn't about putting design at the bottom of the agenda at all. This is about using design as a tool to build a communal vision with everybody. There's another one of the terraces in Leighton. So since Leighton, we've delivered about 28 high street regeneration projects in and around London. We work quite locally, actually, because these projects require a huge amount of personal investment, and it's good to be local. Each of these projects is different. There isn't a methodology that we superimpose on any of these sites. It's about going there with an open mind and discovering the idiosyncrasies and the specifics of each site and working through with local people what the outcome will be in terms of the architectural regeneration proposal. In Sutton, we found that although there was a nighttime economy and lots of shops were desperately trying to trade at night, that they were facing an uphill struggle because nobody knew that. So this was a GLA funded project, and we put all our money into neon. This is a nice story in Nunhead, where a father and a son, the father was running a motor spare shop on the high street, and the son really got into dog grooming. And, the original briefing from the two of them was, well, you've got to accommodate both of us, despite the father's distinct reservations about his son's business proposal, and in particular, his colour choice. So it was really lovely when I came back 6 months after the project was done to do the defect inspection, and I encountered the old man inside the shop painting the counter pink. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, my son's being really successful, and we're thinking of closing down the motor spares shop, and I'm going into business with him." So that's the real sort of social success story there. Here, a fringe town centre. You'll know about the planning headaches that we face in the UK, where people draw red boundary lines around areas that are either borough boundaries, that are what people call ward boundaries, or character areas, and that policy actually limits to what we can do to improve that area to that boundary, and that it's really difficult to come up with overarching projects. As a result, a lot of the town centres in London that are on the fringes of local authority boundaries are really suffering because nobody can bother or can stomach the challenge of engaging with neighbouring boroughs on coming up with a communal vision. And this project in Finsbury Park, Islington, Hackney and Haringey all mucking in together and realising we've got to tackle this because Finsbury Park is a growing and changing town centre which is also suffering from real deprivation. And the three of them coming together and working across 3 borough boundaries on a high street regeneration project. And here, this project in Francis Road in Waltham Forest, yes, it was in a very much a sense a sort of traditional high street regeneration project, but we also discovered that there was a real disconnect between the community and their local high street. And we also discovered that there were 2 primary schools, one at the one end of the high street and one at the other end. And we felt that if only we could engage all the children in taking ownership and responsibility for the local shops, that this place could thrive again. And it absolutely worked out like that. We ended up spending more of our time teaching rather than doing drawings, but that served the purpose that it needed to serve. This project is about bringing new uses onto the high street. High streets are places of innovation, and here we took over an empty shop in Morden and ran it for the local authority as an arts and cultural space, and it's designed to bring new audiences out there to ultimately support also existing businesses. Heritage has got its place in high street regeneration. People are very fond of their local heritage, and this is in Morden, the Morden Court Parade, which had fallen into very disparate ownership, even though you can see the design as one of coherence across the whole terrace. The fact that all the buildings had fallen into disparate ownership and nobody being able to agree on a maintenance regime meant that before we started, every building had an arbitrary line painted across the facade where the presumed ownership of the one owner ended and where the next one started. The high street isn't just about retail. It really isn't. Here's a project that we've worked on with Haringey Council. Haringey knows that about 90% of jobs in the borough are with organisations or companies that employ fewer than 10 employees. So real concern as housing intensification moves out that small businesses are displaced and the impact that would have on jobs locally. So car park at the back of the town hall, really costing the council money in safekeeping and management. And here vision for a project which would create jobs and accommodate jobs, but also which would help to shift people's perception of their town centre and what it can do, and a place and a project which can involve others in the making of it. That was right at the outset of our brief. One of the first acts we did was paint this building blue, and it seems rather arbitrary, but it's got a really important function in that it's immediately shifted people's perception of the place from a drab old 1980s building to something that's got some new interest to it. And then we started designing and building, and we worked with about 100 volunteers on this project. We designed it specifically to be at a human scale and built with materials that can be bought from the local builders merchant up the road, so that it could be managed without machines and without the sort of huge challenges that come with large-scale construction. And as a result, we trained 8 carpentry apprentices and worked with over 100 volunteers. That's our site manager, Alice, who's a Part 1 architect that we trained up. She was really interested in running this project. We trained her up in site management, and she ended up running the project on site. And volunteering sessions were really about skills. We had small teams with skilled carpenters and lay people who wouldn't just sweep the floor, but who would actually make a real meaningful contribution and would learn to build things. And one of my friends who works at a really, really big London practice designing bridges all across the world, he came to this session and he said, afterwards, he said, "Jan, this is amazing. I never knew how buildings were built." And then, working across ages and demographies is really important, because what we can do with an engaged design and construction process is also heal some of the sort of challenges that communities are facing in terms of loneliness. And the deal was, you come and work hard for a day, you get some skills, some really good skills, you meet some new people, and you get free lunch. And that seems to work every time, actually. And there it is finished, and there's the terrace on the ground. And whilst in other places high street shops are closing down, we've built new high street shops, and it's working. And that's one of our tenants on site who makes ethical bags only from UK-sourced materials. And that's the bus which we converted, and which a great collaboration of 2 operators actually took on, a microbrewery and a cafe. So now we've got almost 24-hour operation on site, and that's how it looks inside. So Blue House Yard has helped to train 8 carpentry apprentices. It involved over 100 volunteers during construction. It created a key civic space in the heart of the town centre, something the council didn't really envisage would ever happen with this project. It's created or safeguarded 50 jobs on the high street. There's 50 people working in Blue House Yard, a project that was previously costing the council money to maintain. It's helping to redefine the purpose and identity of Wood Green, and that's really great, because they're long-term plans for the redevelopment in Wood Green, and Haringey have real genuine ambitions to take on some of these businesses that they have that have had a space in Blue House Yard to take up permanent tenancies in ground floor units. It's put Wood Green on the map through international press coverage and design awards. And really that's also made a real difference to other local businesses beyond. A brief project called Future Hoxton, just to show that this engagement can happen at all levels and not just on small projects. So we teamed up with the Pier Gallery in Hoxton, who've got a shop front on Hoxton Street, and I worked with my friend William Hodgson from UCL to devise a project that could see the local community have an input in planning policy for Hoxton, because there's a real concern there that the Silicon roundabout and development pressure from the city, from the east, could really overrun a really sort of fragile ecology of people living in Hoxton. And we made a huge model, the size of a king-size bed, involving school children and in creative processes, and ultimately the Mayor of Hackney and local councillors to put forward their vision of what really needs to be safeguarded in Hoxton and what should be enshrined in policy. And what's really significant to this engagement in planning processes isn't something uncommon, but that the whole planning process was on show in a shopfront gallery in the public eye and involved all ages and denominations of local people. And that's one of my favourite things that I couldn't have cooked up, actually, as an architect and master planner, that one of the participants left behind for us to think about when we finished the project as a comment. Other little project, they're all over the place, community centres. Real struggle, community centres, because they need management and they never have any resources for them. And Clarion owns them all across the country. And quite often, the people that run them, who has got the key, are an old guard of people who had a sort of civic interest in keeping the community together and are really struggling to find young audiences engaging with that asset that's out there for them to use. So we ran a series. We often start projects with a party, actually. We ran a party and a design workshop for children, because children are great. They take the message further. They've got a whole family attached to them. They have brothers and sisters. They have uncles, aunts. And if they've had a good experience and been involved in a public project, we suddenly have got 10, 12 people involved rather than just one person. There is the second stage of the consultation process. And what's key to this is that right at the beginning, we didn't have any preconceived ideas, the same as in Leighton, of what this project might look like. But it was working with the children and the materials at hand to sort of work out what we should be doing. So that was the next stage of the design process, where again we came out. We then took back what the children provided for us and worked this up into a more coherent set of drawings, and using our design judgment to refine some of the ideas that people had come up with, and carried out a more conventional consultation event with a more conventional sort of poster that some of you will have seen. And then as the next stage, we called for volunteers to help build the project. Again, we scaled it at a scale that people could help. And just 3 weekends ago, everybody came downstairs in St. Quintin's, and people who'd never actually been involved in anything around the community centre put on their overalls and helped paint the project. And that's our client, who we rather exhausted through the project. But ultimately, she really enjoyed herself. And I haven't got a finished picture because it's still finishing that project. King's Cross Skip Garden, different project, but again aimed at involving a range of people in a civic project on one of the most complex sites in London, the most complex regeneration projects involving 8 tube lines, 3 mainline trains going through it, a canal and various roads and a road network going through it too. And that doesn't mean that a communal or civic project needs to be excluded from anybody's agenda. So I worked with my colleague Julia King from the Bartlett. We were teaching at the time a degree unit, and these are the students, and we said we want to do a real project with you. So we teamed up with the charity Global Generation, who've been running a garden in the King's Cross development area for nearly a decade when we started working with them. And it was a lucky coincidence that they were about to move sites, because they were given a new site, because the site they were on previously was being developed. And we were fortunate enough that they would welcome us into that process. And suddenly our students didn't just have their tutors and their work pinned up on the wall. They had to work in a completely different way, because they had to communicate with lay people about what they were doing and get sign-off and buy-in from funders, from the developer who was involved in design decisions, and also from real clients. And ultimately, we submitted a planning application. This was the fastest planning consent that I've ever secured in London. Within 4 weeks, we had a planning permission from Camden Council. And it was the students who submitted the planning application. I took a few of them to work in my office so we could oversee things a little bit. And they wrote the access and design statement. They raised a lot of the funding, and they graduated at the Bartlett having designed and built a communal garden in King's Cross. And that's them starting off on site. And obviously, it was a project much too big to master, so people had to bring their mums. There's another mum and their friends. And any of these weren't my students. They were all from other schools doing medical studies and all sorts of things. And suddenly, if you take on a project that's slightly larger than what you can manage, you're going to need help, and you're going to grow the community that benefits from it and invests themselves in it. And this really is about collaboration. At college, at university, most of our courses are about individual excellence, and that's how we mark students' work. But this project, they actually physically weren't able to realise without relying on their friends and mates and mums and dads, and also other people in the profession too, because we got a range of structural engineers to involve themselves, engage themselves, who donated their time for free to work with the students and create a proper mini design team. And then Charlie Redman, who built this structure and who actually did an internship in a metal fabricator as part of his degree course to fabricate this, and worked very closely with Arup to design the lightest possible structure they could possibly come up with. He won the AJ Small Projects Award against a huge selection of the best and the most amazing projects, all of which cost at least 10 times as much as his project. And that's Rachel's building, and Rachel was a second-year architecture student, and she managed to, again, bind a huge community to her building through the donation of windows. People come back to the Skip Garden and look around and discover their old living room windows, which is a nice story to tell. And then a chicken coop, which Valerie designed. And she designed a chicken coop and fairly early on in the process. And we said, well, you're going to have some chickens, because otherwise you don't know what they need. So the first thing she did at first term, she bought herself 2 chickens, which ended up living in her garden that she then designed for. And now, well, it's open to the public. And it's going to be demolished in November to make room for the permanent redevelopment of the site in King's Cross. But what will never be lost through the demolition is the legacy that is left. And I'll just show you a really quick snapshot of one of the legacies that it's left, which is the Story Garden that's just opened behind the British Library, and between the British Library and the Crick Centre, which will continue the programme that the Skip Garden has initially set up. And there it is, with people taking real ownership of the spaces. And what we did here, we didn't have students involved. We adopted a different methodology. We said, we're going to build you half a garden. And we did. We only put the key infrastructure in place. For then, I think nearly 500 people helped build the rest of the garden. And they were corporate volunteers together with people from Somerstown. And that's where it is, how it looks now. And to take the message further, we also converted a milk float, which travels around now, and it's got a kitchen on one side, and it's got a workshop on the other side. So it travels around the communities in Somerstown, some really sort of deprived communities, and organises lunches and gardening activities in their estates. So what does that mean for us as architects? Well, I think what's been for me the biggest recognition really is that as an architect, you need to be able to step back and trust others. And that doesn't mean that you can't have high design ambitions at all, and that the design outcome isn't one that's world class and can win awards. It's about trusting in the process and carefully guiding and directing the process to take others on the journey with you. And that's really where we are. I have a little film. Do I have time to show the film, or are we running out of time? I have a little film to show, which I don't know how to get started on this.
I'm Jane Rutherford. I'm founding director of Global Generation. These days I'm pretty involved in our outreach work, which runs from Regent's Park and through King's Cross, and in the east to Caledonian Road. The work is supporting a patchwork of green spaces and supporting community building as we go, and it's fantastic to have the milk float for this. It's very much a linking and community vehicle. It can feed people off the kitchen at the back here. We can run a gardening workshop on the other side of the float. We very much see it as sowing seeds as it goes.
We really wanted to involve the young people and the children when we were working on the design of the milk floats, and Global Generation do a lot of workshops after school clubs with the local primary schools. We made these white nets which the children could fold up, and that formed model milk floats, kind of 1 to 20 scale. And onto these they built all their designs. We brought loads of art materials and they actually worked on the back of the float. We put all the materials out there. What came out of those workshops was a lot of things to do with cooking and gardening. This informed the sort of design of the float, where we had the kitchen on one side, the garden shed on the other, and the display cabinet at the back. Yeah, it was really good to have them around and to kind of have their enthusiasm. That really helped.
Thank you.
Jan, if you'd like to come and join me at the front. I think we're going to run on till 1 so we can take a few questions for Jan. So usual method through Mentimeter, or if you'd like to ask one in an old-fashioned way, then do put up your hand. I'm going to kick off with the first question. It sounds like most of your work has been for local authorities and charities, but you've obviously also worked for Argent as well at King's Cross. And we're also hearing that there's kind of an increased demand from private sector clients for socially responsible projects. And I just wondered to what extent you felt that your approach was replicable or scalable, because it seems it's very volunteer-led, it relies a lot on voluntary effort, it's very kind of bottom-up, which is fantastic. But I wondered if you've given any thought to how that approach might be scaled to, you know, the largest of private sector projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way the Future Hoxton project is one that showed how this could work at a planning scale, at a master planning scale even. And it's not about, this isn't about building everything the community wants. People are smart and they understand what the constraints are and what the payoffs are for certain things. And people understand if you tell them, well, I've got to build 300 flats in order to regenerate the public realm, because ultimately when we sell them, then we'll generate the capital that does. The problem is that the way that we often collaborate and traditionally work and consult communities is that all decisions have been made already, and that these options and trade-offs are never subject to discussion. It's just a sort of, quite often still, is a rubber stamping exercise. And we often get project briefs from clients who said, oh, well, we'll just do this and decide all this in committee, and then we'll talk to people. I think it's really important to relax and be honest with people and go out there and embark on the journey with everybody with a non-predetermined outcome, because in the end, in my mind, that reduces risk rather than increase risk, because there's a statutory planning process anyway, and I think you can only gain and win by involving people's opinions and thoughts and fears and visions early on. And really that's where the main difference lies for me, that you've got to go into a project with an open mind and with the willingness and ability to listen, and then it can work on massive projects, and I think it can de-risk massive projects too.
So there's lots of questions coming through really about actually how to make this process of community engagement work. So we've got one question around the kind of design and construction liabilities of directly involving volunteers. Also some questions around whether you have a particular methodology for decision making. So really a kind of, what's your kind of toolkit for engaging communities in the process?
Well, the toolkit always starts with listening. And that's what we as architects, I think, sometimes get wrong. And some people will rant, and that's okay. And then they come back the next time, and then they'll realise you're still there. And that's when they get surprised and when they're realising you're starting to invest yourself. So that's the key first bit of the toolkit that's there. Then I think not to have a preconceived idea is really important. And yes, there are project parameters which are fixed. There's a budget and there's a client and there is a site, and we communicate all of these. But we all know as creative people, there'll be 1,000,001 solutions to meet that brief. And not to have that idea in your mind, well, I'm going to just do this thing. It's going to be this award-winning thing that's going to be like that. And that's the second really important. And it's actually amazingly liberating, because you come to a consultation event not desperately trying to defend something that you, in the deep of your mind, know is indefensible. But you come there to garner input and then to go away and to respond to that, obviously taking the client's constraints also into account, but coming back to communities next time around and saying, you said this, that's really smart, we've turned that into this. And it's also not about people having direct input in design necessarily, but it's people being involved in the design process. And of course we're professional designers, so it would be unfair to expect lay people to have a real understanding of the complexities of the design and planning process. But coming in there as an advocate, as somebody who who acts just as much in their interest as in the client's interest, so long as the client's signed up to that to begin with, is a really sort of powerful position to have.
So still a lot of interest in this issue around health and safety, kind of insurance, how you actually, I suppose, ensure the sort of personal site safety of the volunteers involved. Because it seems to be so critical that their participation in the making process. Yeah,
there are different processes different ways that we deal with this. We've got public liability and PI insurance like everybody else has, but for these projects one has to be really inventive. One can either, if one works with a charity that does physical engagement anyway with people, or even a housing association that allows workshops and events whose insurance covers these sorts of things, quite often one can give authorship to the event to the client organisation, which divests you obviously from your responsibility initially of ensuring the event. You still have health and safety responsibilities, but you're not insuring it. The way we built Blue House Yard is that we were our own contractor. Young Kattein Architects teamed up with Meanwhile Space, who are the operating organisation for that project, to form a new entity called High Street Works, and we have insurance to involve people in small making processes. And it's amazing, actually. I take health and safety absolutely super serious, but there were hundreds of unskilled people involved in Blue House Yard. Nobody has even cut their thumb. And it's about making this a core of your thinking from the beginning, and being like, well, what scale can I make this so people can still manually handle things without danger? How many people do I have to have on site to ensure this can be safely dealt with? And what stages do I have to go through to make sure that if anything dangerous happens, that we can immediately sort of avert and mitigate the danger on an ad hoc basis? So that's the other method that we've employed. Then something else we've done recently is we've looked into insurance, and we've sought out additional insurance as architects and handymen. So we hold handyman insurance, and we treat volunteers as employees. They get properly inducted, they sign a form that they've been inducted, and they're our employees for the day. And as employees of a company that provides handyman services, they're then insured consequently. But I'm sure there are other smart methods of getting around this. If we work with schools, it's the school's insurance, and obviously what we design as a programme needs to go through their own risk mitigation process to make sure that they're covered. But there isn't a great solution. There is always workarounds that one has to creatively embrace to get there.
And there's a few questions here around kind of project funding, both in terms of where the funding comes from, but also how you make these projects work as part of your own practice business model. So in terms of kind of how projects are funded, are they largely funded by the local authority? And then do you still then have direct access to the communities, business owners who are the beneficiaries of that? And then so the flip side of that is, do you need to do other types of work to sort of, I suppose, subsidise this kind of more community-led work?
We mostly do community-led work. The very vast majority of our works is community-led work. There's the ambition to break even or make a profit on each project. Sometimes we break that rule and then something else has to pay, evidently, but that's the starting point. If we have charities and we see some of their projects as a real business development opportunity for us and they don't yet have project funding, i.e. we're helping them to get project funding, then we give them really reduced rates, because ultimately we're getting a real benefit to break into a new sector and do a new project that's got a real sort of impact on our public profile. It's really important to find clients that value the work we do. There's no point trying to sell to somebody who's just off to make a quick buck. Because they won't be prepared to fund the extra time that we do need to put into these projects. So we charge we charge more than for architectural services. We have to, because our commitment to work with communities, talk to communities is significant. And we also need architects to do that and skilled people to do that, so that there's a direct line of accountability. We can't send out and subcontract the consultation event. It's got to be one line of command, so that, and I've had a really nice experience actually. We did a consultation with Peabody for a housing project, which was very controversial to begin with. And I was at a consultation event, and there was one of the residents talked to me for half an hour, and when he left in the end he said, "So who are you?" And I said, I'm Jan Kattein. And he was like, "What? Who are you? You work for Jan?" I said, no, I'm Jan Kattein. And he was like, "Oh right, I didn't expect that the director would show up to the consultation." And it's important that we have that accountability directly, and we work for a wide range of organisations, but most of them understand, embrace and accept that we have to work over the odds for what we deliver.
And a final question may be around the legacy of your project. So obviously, great disappointment to see the project at King's Cross, the Skip Garden, coming to the end of its life in just a month's time. But it's positive that there's a sort of similar project happening at the British Library. But are there also some unintended consequences of some of the regeneration that you've brought about? So, for example, in the event that the business owners who you've supported are tenants rather than leaseholders, is there a risk that the sort of regeneration means they're effectively kind of priced out of the high streets that you've had a role in regenerating?
I think regeneration always is only successful and only ever has an impact if there are a multitude of factors align. And our work alone can never achieve that significant a transformation that it would impact on rents. I would like to think our budgets are generally small, our tools are limited. In Leighton, well, pretty much what we did is a bit of repair and painting. What we can do, though, is we can build more resilient businesses and more resilient communities that can stomach higher rents and have business plans that are future-pointing and that can manage, if the economic climate changes. And really, the example is the one down in Nunhead, where the father and the son shared a business initially and realised actually there's a much more future-proof model here where there's much higher demand than a motor spares business, which really in sort of inner London is not something that, because you don't really repair cars anymore. Lots of people don't own cars. So there's that real potential, and I think the potential outweighs the risk which does exist.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. It's really interesting to hear a different take on grassroots collaboration with local business owners and local communities. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.